The desert morning broke with a cruel brilliance, sunlight spilling over the horizon like molten gold across the vast emptiness, where silence held its breath until broken by the sudden crack of gunfire. Dust rose in trembling clouds, the sharp sting of danger hanging thick in the air. Grace Jameson pressed herself against the broken remains of an overturned wagon, her heart beating a desperate rhythm against her ribs. A woman of Boston, polished by years of proper society, she had never imagined that her journey west would begin with bullets tearing through the stillness of dawn. Yet here she was, 35 years old, a school teacher carrying more secrets than suitcases, stranded on the edge of nowhere, as if fate itself had conspired to test her courage. Each echo of gunfire shook her soul, each heartbeat whispering a single truth. Life was about to change forever. From the smoke and dust, a figure emerged, young, commanding, eyes sharp as storm clouds. He moved with a certainty born not from books or polite drawing rooms, but from survival, from fire and grit. One moment he was on horseback, the next beside her, shielding her from the chaos. He carried no pretense, no polished veneer, only the raw strength of someone who had carved a place in a land that belonged to no one but the brave. His presence unsettled and reassured all at once, a paradox that drew her attention as much as the gun in his hand. She whispered her name with trembling lips, and in return received his, Tucker Ali, a name she would find echoing in her heart long after the dust settled. The air between them shifted like the desert wind, invisible yet undeniable. In that instant, though danger thundered all around, she was aware of more than fear. There was a warmth, faint but healing, as if the universe had conspired to place them in this moment together. His hand brushed hers when he lifted her to safety, and the simple contact sparked a flutter deep inside her chest, something tender, something dangerously alive. Life, she realized, was not finished with her, not even after heartbreak, not even after the shame that had driven her across the continent. Perhaps this merciless land was offering her something she had long forgotten, the chance to begin again. The sun rose higher, merciless yet illuminating, and with every mile they rode, the world of Boston drifted farther away. The rattle of carriage wheels and the whispers of scandal seemed like distant ghosts now. Here, under the vast Arizona sky, the air was different, dry, raw, but filled with possibility. She found herself clinging not just to the reins he guided, but to the fragile hope that perhaps love, in its healing form, might find her again where she least expected it. And as their horse carried them through rock and shadow, her story unfolded toward Rattlesnake Springs, where every stranger's gaze would question who she was, and where one man's steady presence would begin to unravel the walls she had built around her heart. The journey was only beginning, but already the threads of fate were weaving tighter, stitching together two souls that had no reason to meet, yet every reason to remain. Grace didn't yet know that her decision to travel west, born of desperation, would soon bloom into something warmer, more radiant than the Boston summers she once cherished. She didn't yet know that this young man, reckless yet steady, would teach her more about life, love, and healing than years of study ever could. But as the desert wind carried them forward, whispering promises through the dry grass, she began to sense it, the stirring of destiny, soft yet undeniable. And with each breath, the world she thought she had lost gave way to a new one, waiting, beckoning, alive with both peril and promise, leading her deeper into the unknown path of love's embrace. Like a story unfolding with each heartbeat, their beginning was not gentle, not quiet. It was fire and dust, danger and tenderness intertwined. And yet, within it all, there was the softest call, a reminder to cherish moments of beauty even in hardship, to hold on to connection like water in the desert. For those listening, for those watching, if this tale stirs your heart, if it brings a touch of healing warmth to your soul, let that resonance linger. Leave your thoughts, share your feelings, join the journey by keeping close. For love, like every story worth telling, grows brighter when shared, and what begins here will only deepen as we move forward together. And so the path bends toward the town ahead, where dusty streets and curious eyes await, where choices linger and hearts will be tested. Yet already, unseen, the seeds of love are planted, ready to grow beneath the Arizona sun. The ride stretched before them, each hoofbeat carrying Grace farther from the shattered fragments of her old life and deeper into a land that demanded both resilience and surrender. The desert sun poured down like liquid fire, pressing against her bonnet, drying her lips. Yet beside Tucker, Ali, the weight felt strangely lighter, softened by his presence. His arm occasionally brushed against her waist as the horse climbed over uneven ground, and every accidental touch awakened a new awareness, a stirring she had long believed buried beneath years of propriety and disappointment. He was younger, yes, but there was no hesitation in his movements, no doubt in his voice. He spoke little, yet every word seemed rooted in honesty, as though silence itself was sacred and only broken when something true was worth saying. Grace studied him when he wasn't looking, the firm jaw dusted with stubble, the steady grip on the reins, the way his eyes scanned the horizon with vigilance learned from years of hardship. He carried himself like a man twice his age, weathered not by years, but by survival. And yet, when he offered her the canteen with a smile tugging faintly at his lips, she glimpsed something softer beneath, something healing, as if he too longed for more than the endless stretch of trail. Their fingers brushed as she returned the water, and though the contact lasted only a breath, it left warmth lingering in her chest long after. At the stream, when he lifted her from the saddle, his hands rested briefly at her waist, steadying her as though she were something fragile and precious. The moment stretched, sunlight catching in his dark hair, droplets of water tracing his temples, and she felt the faintest pull of longing, startling in its intensity. She stepped back quickly, masking it with a polite thank you. But inside her heart whispered the truth she could not yet admit, that this stranger, bound to her by circumstance, had already begun to feel less like chance and more like destiny. The hours passed as landscape shifted, cacti standing like ancient sentinels, red rocks glowing with the memory of centuries, the air shimmering with heat. She spoke of Boston, of her father's belief in education, and Tucker listened with a quiet respect that wrapped around her like a balm. He admitted to little schooling himself, his life a string of cattle drives, prospecting, scouting, yet in his voice was no shame, only the resilience of someone who had carved knowledge where he could, who had learned to read the language of sky, soil, and silence. The honesty humbled her, healed her, drew her closer. When they reached Rattlesnake Springs at sunset, Grace's heart wavered between relief and something more elusive, a reluctance for the day to end, for the saddle's closeness to be replaced by walls and strangers' eyes. Dusty streets unfolded before them, modest homes, a saloon alive with faint music, the scent of bread drifting from somewhere nearby. To her surprise, it was not disappointment she felt at the simplicity, but a quiet sense of possibility, as though life might, in this humble place, knit itself whole again. At Mrs. Henderson's door, when Tucker said he would not stay, her heart sank in a way she could not name. His promise to check on her the next morning left her with an unexpected flutter, a spark she carried with her into the steaming bath, into the clean gown, into the simple supper. Every detail of the day played again and again in her mind, the outlaws, the ride, the laughter, the gentle steadiness of a man she barely knew. And as she fell asleep to the muted hum of a town she did not yet call home, she realized that healing often began in silence, in stolen glances, in small acts of kindness. Something was shifting, something she could not yet define, but she felt it moving like the current beneath still water, carrying her toward a future she had not dared to imagine. By morning, when the sound of hoofbeats returned and Mrs. Henderson spoke his name with a smile, Grace's pulse quickened against her will. Tucker Ali had already become part of her story, and the days ahead would weave their lives more tightly, stitching hope into the fabric of a land that seemed barren, but was, in truth, overflowing with hidden promise. The morning light spilled across Rattlesnake Springs, soft and golden, carrying with it the quiet rhythm of a town just waking. Grace stepped onto the porch of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, her skirts brushing the wooden boards, and for a moment she simply breathed in the newness of it all. The scent of bacon drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the faint aroma of desert blossoms in the breeze. She could hear the creak of wagon wheels in the distance, the laughter of children chasing one another down the street, and the occasional whinny of horses from the livery. This was no polished Boston Avenue lined with brick houses and gas lamps. This was something raw and unrefined, yet alive, pulsing with the warmth of community. And strangely, she found it comforting, as though the earth itself whispered that beginnings could rise even from ashes. When Tucker appeared at midday, tall and steady as if he belonged to the very dust that clung to his boots, Grace felt a flicker in her chest she could not quite quell. He had come to escort her to Sheriff Bailey, his manner polite yet familiar, as though the distance between rescuer and stranger had already shortened into something gentler. Together they walked the small street, and she noticed how he was greeted by everyone they passed. A nod here, a smile there, a murmured word of trust. It struck her then that this man was more than a drifter. He was woven into the fabric of this place, tied to its survival in ways that no one had explained, but everyone seemed to recognize. His presence beside her steadied her steps, and though she told herself it was only gratitude, she could not deny the quiet, healing comfort that came from being near him. Later that afternoon, she met Eliza Cooper and her little boy Samuel, a child with wide eyes and a voice trembling with both shyness and pride as he showed her the worn primer he had learned to read from. Something inside Grace stirred at the sight. The teacher within her, long denied by scandal and heartbreak, blossomed anew with fierce tenderness. She listened to the boy's halting words, encouraged him with warmth, and in that instant the idea was born. Perhaps she could give these children something more than passing kindness. Perhaps here, in this modest settlement, her purpose could root itself again. The women of the town welcomed her with surprising eagerness, their voices carrying the hope that she might stay, even if only for a while, to teach. Grace felt torn, her mind reminding her of Tucson and its promised position, her heart whispering of this place, of the small hands eager to hold chalk, of the possibility of making a difference where there had been so little light before. She had come west to escape, but here she found herself being called not to run, but to remain. That evening, when Tucker returned from his work at the livery, she found herself walking beside him once more, his easy stride slowing to match her own. The conversation flowed with surprising ease, moving from stories of her father's lectures in Boston to his tales of desert storms and cattle drives. Each word seemed to bridge the distance between them, softening the boundaries of age, of background, of all the things that should have kept them apart. Grace laughed more freely than she had in years, the sound startling her as though it belonged to someone she once knew but had forgotten. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in strokes of rose and amber, Tucker spoke of the coming town dance, his eyes bright with an invitation he did not yet voice fully. Grace felt her pulse quicken, not only at the thought of music and company, but at the unspoken promise that lay beneath his words. Something within her ached to believe that joy could be hers again, that perhaps in this desert land she might find not only healing, but love. When night finally wrapped itself around the town, Grace lay in her small room at Mrs. Henderson's, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts restless. She was supposed to be passing through, on her way to a new chapter already written for her in Tucson. Yet here, only a day past her arrival, she felt a thread binding her to Rattlesnake Springs, to its children, to its people, and most dangerously, to one man whose steady gaze unsettled her more than all the gunfire of that first morning. She turned onto her side, clutching the pillow as if it could steady her racing heart. Change was pressing close, unrelenting, and though she tried to tell herself it was impossible, deep inside she knew she was no longer walking the path she had planned. The current of fate had shifted, and Tucker Ali was at the center of it, drawing her onward into a story she could neither predict nor resist. The days that followed unfolded like pages of a story Grace had not expected to live, each moment carrying her further from the shadows of her past and deeper into the quiet rhythm of Rattlesnake Springs. Morning light painted the valley with gentle hues, and in those hours she found herself among the children of the town, listening to their laughter, their shy voices, their questions that spilled out with such eagerness it brought warmth to her chest. Samuel Cooper's small hand slipped into hers as he guided her to the wide front room of his family's homestead, the space that Eliza had offered freely for lessons. There, benches borrowed from the church were lined against the walls, and scraps of chalk rested in a tin tray, simple tools, yet filled with promise. Grace's heart swelled with a sense of purpose she had not felt in so long, as though this land had not only given her safety, but returned to her the very dream she thought had been stolen in Boston. She began preparing with a diligence that soothed her soul, arranging slates, gathering readers, sketching plans late into the night by the glow of lamplight. Every detail stirred memories of her father's words, that education was the greatest gift one could give. Now, surrounded by dust and desert air, she understood the truth of it more deeply than ever before. Here, where survival demanded so much, knowledge was not a luxury. It was hope itself, a healing thread that might lift a child beyond hardship. As she wrote names into neat columns, imagining the faces of her future pupils, her hands trembled with quiet joy. Tucker appeared often during those preparations, sometimes at the doorway with a word of encouragement, sometimes carrying supplies, a stack of worn readers from the sheriff, a handful of slate boards salvaged from an old-school trunk, a jar of chalk sticks bought at the general store. He never lingered too long, never intruded, but his presence steadied her like the weight of an anchor. And though she reminded herself that gratitude was all she should feel, each glance, each smile, each brush of his hand when passing her a book ignited something warmer, something dangerous in its tenderness. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight turned the desert sky into a canvas of crimson and violet, Tucker invited her to supper. She found herself seated across from him in the town's small eatery, the flicker of lamplight softening his features, making his storm-colored eyes glow with an intimacy she struggled to ignore. He asked about her life in Boston, and though she had vowed to leave that part of herself behind, she told him more than she had told anyone since leaving, about her engagement, the betrayal, the whispers that drove her west. He listened without judgment, his silence not heavy, but healing, as though he absorbed her pain and gave back only acceptance. When he finally spoke, it was with a quiet conviction that left her throat tight. "Their loss, Miss Jameson. Out here, we value truth more than polished lies." Later that night, unable to sleep, Grace stood by the small window of her room and looked out at the moonlit street. She thought of Tucker's words, of his steady gaze, of the way his presence made her feel less alone. She wrapped her shawl tighter, as though it could hold together the feelings threatening to spill from her heart. For years she had armored herself against disappointment, against the ache of wanting too much, and yet here, in this unexpected place, that armor was beginning to crack. It frightened her, but beneath the fear was something else, relief. To feel again, even imperfectly, was to know she was still alive. When the first day of lessons arrived, children crowded into the Cooper homestead with eyes wide and voices hushed in anticipation. Grace welcomed them with her warmest smile, her voice soft but steady as she began, "My name is Miss Jameson, and I am honored to be your teacher." The room filled with the scratch of chalk on slate, the murmurs of recited letters, the bursts of laughter when little hands stumbled over sums. Grace's heart soared, each small triumph a healing balm that stitched her soul back together. She was no longer the woman running from whispers. She was a teacher again, alive with purpose, surrounded by the future she had nearly lost. That afternoon, as she stepped outside, weary but glowing, she found Tucker waiting by the gate, his hat in hand, his smile warm. He asked nothing of her, only offered to walk her home. The silence between them was easy, filled with the sound of the creek, the rustle of wind through cottonwoods, the simple presence of two souls learning to move in step. When they reached Mrs. Henderson's porch, he paused, his hand brushing hers in a gesture so brief it might have been imagined. Yet it lingered with her long after he walked away, his figure swallowed by the shadows of the street. Grace climbed the stairs to her room, her heart unsteady, her spirit strangely light. The town, the children, and Tucker. Together they were weaving something new into her life, something fragile yet radiant. She did not yet call it love, but in the quiet of that night, as she drifted into sleep, she admitted the truth she had been resisting. She no longer felt like a woman in exile. She felt at last as though she had found the beginning of home, and in that healing realization her journey carried her softly toward the next chapter, where the boundaries between duty and desire would be tested by the growing fire of her heart. The days slipped into one another with a quiet rhythm, each sunrise pulling Grace deeper into the life of Rattlesnake Springs, and each sunset leaving her heart more tangled in threads she could no longer pretend not to see. Her schoolroom at the Cooper homestead blossomed with energy. 15 children filling the benches, their bright eyes eager for knowledge, their small hands smudged with chalk dust and ink stains. She divided them into groups, older boys wrestling with arithmetic, while younger ones struggled with their first letters, and though the work left her exhausted, it also brought her a joy so fierce it almost frightened her. In their laughter and their stubborn determination, she felt herself healing. It was as if every lesson erased a little more of Boston's shadows, each child's triumph sewing her fractured spirit into wholeness again. Tucker appeared often, sometimes leaning against the doorway to watch the children recite, sometimes slipping inside at the end of lessons with a quiet word of praise. He never intruded, never took more space than she offered, but his presence was steady as the horizon, something she had begun to rely on without meaning to. One afternoon she caught Samuel whispering to a friend that Mr. Ali had been waiting outside nearly an hour just to see her smile. The words made her cheeks burn, but the warmth that spread through her chest was not embarrassment alone. It was hope, fragile but undeniable. The townspeople noticed too. Mrs. Henderson teased her gently over supper, her eyes twinkling with mischief, while Eliza Cooper's knowing smiles carried the weight of a woman who had once been young and uncertain herself. Grace tried to brush it aside, to remind herself that Tucker was 10 years her junior, that she had a contract in Tucson, that she had no right to hope for anything more than friendship. Yet her heart betrayed her each time he rode into town, dust rising around him like a halo, his storm-colored eyes softening when they found her. She told herself she was imagining it, that kindness was not affection, that she could not afford to mistake gratitude for something greater. But when he asked her to supper one evening, voice low and eyes searching hers, she heard herself accept before reason could intervene. The meal was simple, bread, beans and stew in a corner booth of the small restaurant, but to Grace it felt like a feast. Conversation flowed easily, laughter slipping from her lips in a way she had thought lost forever. Tucker spoke of the desert, of lonely trails and star-scattered skies, of the freedom and weight of a land untamed. She listened, captivated, each story carving a deeper mark upon her heart. When her turn came, she told him of Boston, of the library her father had cherished, of the scandal she had fled. The pain of it was sharp, but somehow gentler in his presence, as if sharing it with him diluted the bitterness. His hand brushed hers briefly across the table, a touch filled not with boldness, but with reassurance, a reminder that wounds did not make her less. His silence was not avoidance, but acceptance, and in that quiet she found a kind of healing more powerful than words. Afterward, when he led her outside beneath the desert sky, the stars unfolded like a cathedral above them, endless and serene. He showed her a ridge where the valley spread wide, the moonlight casting silver over the land. They stood together in silence, the cool wind carrying the scent of sage and dust, their shoulders nearly touching. Grace felt the ache of longing, raw and unfamiliar after so many years of restraint, and though propriety screamed for distance, her heart leaned toward him. She wondered if he felt it too, the gravity of something forming between them, something neither of them had chosen, yet both could no longer deny. The days that followed deepened the tension between duty and desire. Each morning she walked into the schoolroom with determination, reminding herself that her place was temporary, that her path led to Tucson. Yet each evening, when Tucker found her with a bouquet of wild flowers or a leather-bound book of poetry he had somehow remembered she loved, the certainty wavered. His gifts were not grand, but thoughtful, each one a testament that he listened, that he cared in ways too precise to dismiss as mere courtesy. When he asked her to read aloud to him on the porch, his eyes fixed on her rather than the words, she felt her resolve unravel thread by thread. Grace tried to reason with herself, tried to remind her heart of its fragility, of the years between them, of the obligations that awaited her. But when Tucker touched her hand at the end of another long day, when his voice softened as he told her she was remarkable, the arguments dissolved like mist under the sun. She was not foolish enough to call it love, not yet, but she could no longer pretend that something within her wasn't awakening. One night, as the town prepared for the upcoming dance, Mrs. Henderson helped her arrange her hair, whispering that life was too short to measure happiness by numbers alone. Grace smiled at the older woman's words, but inside she trembled, caught between the safety of duty and the wild, terrifying promise of the heart. The music, the laughter, the touch of a hand during a waltz, they hovered just beyond her, waiting. And though she tried to steel herself for the inevitable farewell, she could not deny the truth that grew stronger with each passing day. She was no longer simply a traveller passing through. She was a woman standing at the edge of something vast and luminous, something that called to her with both healing and fire. And when Tucker's voice lingered in her thoughts long after she closed her eyes, she knew the choice she had tried so hard to ignore was slowly, inexorably approaching. The night of the dance arrived with air crisp and clear, the stars above stretching wide like lanterns hung by unseen hands. Grace stood before the small mirror in her room, smoothing the folds of her one fine dress, the blue silk she had carried west more out of habit than hope. She had thought it too grand for a place like Rattlesnake Springs, but as Mrs. Henderson pinned the last strand of her hair, she whispered that the desert too deserved beauty, and that a woman should never shrink herself to match her surroundings. Grace looked at her reflection and saw not the woman Boston had discarded, but someone new, worn, yes, yet radiant in her own way, a light rekindled where she thought only ashes remained. When Tucker arrived, his dark suit clean and his boots polished, he looked almost startled at the sight of her. His usual ease faltered into silence, and in that silence Grace felt more truth than words could have given. He offered his arm, she took it, and together they stepped into the lantern-lit hall where the townsfolk gathered. Music curled through the air, laughter and voices weaving around them, yet for Grace the world narrowed to the weight of Tucker's hand at her back, guiding her gently, respectfully, as though she were something precious. Their first dance began awkwardly, two people out of practice, but soon their movements found a rhythm, his steps steady, hers responsive, the music carrying them as if the room itself conspired to push them closer. Grace felt the warmth of his palm through the thin silk, the heat of his breath when he leaned near to guide her. It was not merely a dance. It was a confession spoken without words, a quiet claiming of space in each other's lives. Around them, townsfolk smiled, whispered, watched, but none of it mattered. The world was reduced to the sound of a fiddle, the pressure of his hand, the look in his eyes when the music slowed. Later, when she stepped outside for air, Tucker followed, the night folding them into quiet. The desert stretched endless and serene, the kind of silence that made honesty unavoidable. He looked at her then, not as rescuer or companion, but as a man stripped of every shield. "I'd want you to stay," he said, voice rough yet steady. "Not just for the children, but for me." The words hung between them, heavy with possibility, fragile as glass. Grace's heart surged and trembled all at once. She thought of her contract in Tucson, of the whispers she had fled, of the years between their ages that logic insisted mattered. Yet when she met his gaze, all she saw was sincerity. No pretense, no calculation, only a man willing to risk his heart. Her breath shook as she admitted softly, "I feel something too." It was not a full surrender, not yet, but it was the first brick removed from the wall she had built around herself. Tucker stepped closer, his nearness warm, healing in a way she had not known she needed. He did not kiss her, not then. Instead, he simply touched her hand, his thumb tracing a circle that made her pulse race, as though to promise he could wait for her answer. The days that followed became a quiet trial of her heart. Each morning she stood before her students, teaching with all the passion her soul carried, while each evening Tucker's presence drew her further into the delicate balance between duty and desire. The children thrived beneath her care, and whispers spread of building a true schoolhouse for the town, a dream that shimmered with temptation. And through it all, Tucker remained steady, helping when he could, listening when she needed, never pressing yet, never hiding the truth of what he felt. Grace lay awake many nights, torn between the safety of her obligations and the reckless pull of her heart. Boston had taught her the cruelty of misplaced trust, yet here in this dusty town she had found not judgment but acceptance, not whispers but warmth. And most of all, she had found him, young, yes, but strong in spirit, a man whose quiet devotion stitched light into the broken places of her soul. She tried to tell herself it was impossible, that she was too old, too bound to another promise, but deep inside she already knew her life was no longer the one she had planned. It was the one unfolding now, each glance, each touch, each breath shared with Tucker, pulling her closer to a truth she could no longer deny. As dawn broke one morning, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Grace stood at her window watching the town stir to life. Children ran through the street, voices carrying like music, and she felt the tug of two worlds colliding within her. Behind her lay the certainty of duty, ahead of her the wild, healing promise of love. She pressed a hand to her heart and whispered a prayer for clarity, though part of her already knew the path she was meant to follow. For love, when it came, was not always sensible. It was simply real, and it was here, waiting for her in the steady hands and storm-colored eyes of Tucker Ali. And with that quiet knowing, she turned toward the day where her choice would draw nearer with every breath, every step, every lesson written in chalk and sealed by the fire of her awakening heart. The morning after the dance lingered in Grace's memory like the scent of wildflowers pressed between pages of a beloved book, delicate yet impossible to forget. She awoke with sunlight spilling across the floorboards, her heart still echoing the music, her body remembering the steady rhythm of Tucker's hand guiding her through each turn. Every glance they had shared, every pause when silence spoke louder than words, returned to her in vivid fragments that left her chest aching with both fear and longing. She tried to steady herself with routine, preparing her lessons, gathering her books, but each movement carried the weight of his confession, the tremor of her own response. The certainty she had clung to before, that her path lay in Tucson, was unraveling thread by fragile thread. At the schoolroom, the children sensed something different in her, though they could not name it. Their laughter seemed brighter, their eagerness deeper, as if they too felt the current of change stirring the air. Grace moved among them with renewed tenderness, her heart swelling at each triumph, the smallest child tracing her letters without faltering, the oldest boy reciting history with newfound confidence. Teaching had always been her calling, yet here it had become more than a duty. It was a lifeline, a reminder that healing did not always arrive in grand gestures, but in the quiet victories of those who believed in her. And when she caught sight of Tucker leaning at the doorframe once more, his eyes softened with pride as he watched Samuel eagerly show his sums, she felt the truth settle inside her. This town needed her. But more than that, she needed it. That afternoon, Tucker asked her to walk with him along the creek where the cottonwoods swayed in the golden light. They moved slowly, their silence not awkward but companionable, filled with the song of water and the flutter of wings overhead. At last he spoke, voice low and unguarded. "I know you've got your contract in Tucson. I won't stand in the way of what you feel you owe, but I can't pretend it doesn't matter, Grace. These weeks, having you here, seeing what you've brought to this place, they've changed me." His words were steady, yet his eyes betrayed vulnerability, the quiet plea of a man who had already risked his heart. Grace paused, her hand brushing the rough bark of a cottonwood as she searched for courage. "You've changed me too," she admitted softly. "I came here running from shame, from whispers I couldn't silence. I thought I'd be nothing more than a stranger passing through. But these children, this town, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Belonging." The word broke in her throat, yet Tucker's hand found hers, strong and warm, and she felt steadied by his touch. For a moment she let herself simply breathe, leaning into the healing comfort of that contact. Evenings became moments of quiet intimacy. Sometimes he brought her books of poetry, asking her to read aloud beneath the porch lamp as the desert cooled. Sometimes they rode out to the ridge, watching the horizon fade into stars, the silence between them filling with unspoken promises. And one evening, when she finished reading, his voice broke the hush with words that cut straight into her heart. "I don't know much about poetry, but I know this. I feel about you the way those words sound." Her breath caught, and though propriety told her to retreat, her heart surged forward, trembling yet alive. The days pressed closer to her departure, each one thick with unspoken decisions. She told herself she would leave as planned, that she could not abandon her obligations in Tucson. Yet when Tucker kissed her hand outside the boarding house, lingering just long enough for her skin to burn with memory, her resolve faltered. She lay awake at night, torn between two truths, the life she had promised to another town, and the life that seemed to be blooming here, wild and unexpected, like flowers in the desert after rain. Her students, too, tugged at her heart with bonds she had not anticipated. Samuel shyly presented her with a drawing of the schoolroom, herself at the front with a halo above her head, and Grace wept silently when he pressed it into her hands. "So you remember us," he whispered. She hugged him fiercely, knowing she could never forget. Eliza Cooper's kind words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the bravest thing was not to stay the course, but to change it. Grace had always believed courage meant enduring, yet perhaps it also meant choosing joy, even when it defied reason. On her final day of lessons, farewells filled the room with tears and embraces. Parents thanked her, children clung to her skirts, and still she smiled bravely, though inside her chest her heart was unraveling. And when the last child left, Tucker appeared in the doorway, his figure tall against the fading light. He stepped closer, his voice steady yet raw. "I meant every word I've said, Grace. Whatever you decide, I'll carry it with me. But know this, you've become part of me." She wanted to answer, wanted to surrender to the truth she felt each time his eyes met hers, but fear tangled with longing, leaving her silent. Instead, she let him walk her home, each step a quiet prayer, each glance a promise she could not yet bring herself to speak. And when they paused on Mrs. Henderson's porch, he reached out, his hand cupping her cheek with reverence, asking permission without words. Grace leaned into the touch, her heart surging forward, and when his lips found hers, it was as though something inside her, long dormant, bloomed at last. The kiss was tender, reverent, yet filled with a fire that healed as it burned, a joining of souls that had been waiting for this moment all along. When they parted, breathless and trembling, he whispered, "I'll be thinking of you, wherever you go." And she, her voice choked with emotion, replied, "And I of you." They both knew her departure loomed, yet in that moment it did not matter. What mattered was the truth between them, raw and undeniable. That night, Grace lay awake, her lips tingling with memory, her heart torn between fear and hope. She had come west to escape, to bury herself in duty, but the desert had given her more than refuge. It had given her love, unexpected and healing, a love she could no longer ignore. And as dawn painted the sky with its first strokes of gold, she realized her journey was not ending. It was only just beginning. The choice still lay ahead, but within her heart the answer was already stirring, bright as the desert sun, steady as the hand that had lifted her from danger and held her ever since. The stagecoach rattled down the dusty road, carrying Grace away from the only place that had made her feel alive in years, yet her heart refused to move forward. She leaned against the small window, eyes scanning the horizon, as if by sheer will she could summon Tucker's figure one last time. The town behind her had already receded into a blur, its people left with tearful goodbyes and tokens of gratitude pressed into her hands. Children's drawings, wildflowers, polished stones, little fragments of love she had gathered as if they could hold her together. She told herself this was right, that duty demanded her to continue to Tucson, that she was too old for reckless decisions. Yet the silence inside the coach pressed on her chest until it became unbearable. Her fingers clutched at her skirt, trembling with the ache of what she was leaving behind. And then, like a vision carved from her very longing, a rider appeared in the distance. Dust rose in a golden cloud around him, his horse galloping with desperate urgency. Even before she could make out his face, she knew. Her heart leapt, her breath caught, and tears blurred her vision. "Driver, please stop," she called, her voice breaking. The horses slowed reluctantly, the wheels groaning as the coach shuddered to a halt. She stepped down into the sunlight, her skirts tangling around her legs, and stood there trembling as Tucker reined in his horse and dismounted in a single fluid motion. He came toward her, eyes raw, expression unguarded, and for a heartbeat they only stared at one another, two souls suspended in the moment that would decide their lives. "I thought you weren't coming," she whispered, her voice carried off by the wind. Tucker's chest rose and fell, his hat clutched in his hands. "I wasn't planning to," he admitted, his voice rough, "but I realized I'd regret it every day of my life if I didn't try one more time." He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until she could feel the heat of him, smell the dust and leather that clung to his skin. "Grace," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with a force that left her breathless. "I love you. I know it's sudden. I know it doesn't make sense to the world, but it's true. You've become the piece of me I didn't even know was missing. Stay, not just for the children, not just for the school. Stay for us." The desert seemed to still around them, the only sound her own ragged breathing, the pounding of her heart. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity and hope, raw and unpolished, but unshakably real. She wanted to say no, to cling to the safety of reason, but her body betrayed her, leaning forward, her hands reaching for his as though they belonged there all along. "I'm afraid," she confessed, her voice breaking. Tucker's hands closed gently around hers, steady and warm. "So am I," he said softly. "But some things are worth being afraid for. Some things are worth the leap." Her mind whispered of age, of propriety, of Boston's cruel voices still echoing in memory. But her heart, fragile yet fierce, beat against all those doubts with a single truth. Here, with him, she was alive. She pressed her forehead against his chest, breathing him in, letting the healing warmth of his embrace seep into every broken place inside her. "I'll stay," she whispered, the words trembling yet sure. Tucker pulled her into his arms fully then, his laughter breaking like sunlight after a storm, spinning her in a circle until she cried out with joy. The driver muttered about schedules, but Grace only laughed, tears and laughter mingling, her soul lighter than it had been in years. When they returned to Rattlesnake Springs, the townsfolk gathered once more, but this time their faces were bright with welcome, not farewell. Mrs. Henderson crossed her arms knowingly on the porch, a smile tugging at her lips. "I knew you'd figure it out," she said, her voice filled with warmth. Grace embraced her, overwhelmed by the sense of home settling around her like a long-forgotten quilt. That night, sitting beside Tucker on the porch swing, the stars blazing above them, she leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice soft but sure. "What happens now?" she asked. He tightened his arm around her, his eyes alight with promise. "Now," he said, "we build something together. A schoolhouse, a life, a home, and us." She laughed through tears, her heart so full it ached. For the first time in so long, the future did not frighten her. It glowed, vast and beautiful, as if the desert itself had bloomed into possibility. Years later, as their daughter Emma slept peacefully in her arms and children's laughter rang from the sturdy schoolhouse Tucker had built with his own hands, Grace would look back on that moment and know. Choosing love had been the truest, bravest choice she had ever made. Age, duty, fear, all had melted before the simple, healing truth of two hearts daring to meet. And as the stars stretched eternal above them, Grace finally understood what she had been searching for all along. Not escape, not reputation, not even redemption, but love that healed, love that endured, love that turned the desert into home. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the warmth and healing in their journey, let your thoughts be heard. Leave a comment, share your feelings, and if you wish to walk further into stories like this, remember to like and subscribe. Every gesture of yours keeps this light alive, and together we can keep weaving tales that soothe the soul and remind us all that love, in its truest form, is always worth the risk.